In this video, we're going to be continuing on in chapter 14, where we were talking about stress and health. And so this is section 3, where we get to start talking about managing stress, and we're going to talk some more about some of our coping behaviors. Now, some coping behaviors came up at the end of the last recording, but here we're going to focus a little bit more on looking specifically at how we can manage stress, cope with stress through mental components, body and physical components, and then also components of the environment, so the situation that we're in. So we're going to break down our discussion into those three main areas. But I guess first off, we should talk about what stress management is. And just like the name implies, these are going to be techniques that help us manage and try and reduce the effects of stress. So these techniques are our attempt at counteracting both physical and psychological aspects of stress, the internal, the external, and everything in between. So general term for all of those different components. And we have lots and lots of different ways that we can try and manage stress through different aspects of our experience, mental, physical, situational. And of course, as always, this is just going to be a couple of different highlights for each of these, rather than a complete and holistic view of all the different ways that we can manage stress. We're just going to hit some high points. But starting off with controlling the mind, we can start by looking at repression or repressive coping. Now, again, this might overlap a little bit with our last recording, but here, repression is all about avoiding a situation or thoughts of anything that might remind us of a particular stressor. So this can also include things like maintaining an artificially positive viewpoint, basically smile and pretend like nothing's wrong. And this can lead to actually forcing things out of mind. So focusing only on the here, the now, what's good, and completely ignoring any potential stressors, whether they were past stressors or upcoming future stressors, just to deny that they exist. So people engaging in repression are deliberately ignoring the problem. And as bad as that sounds on the surface, it seems like a bad thing to sort of delude yourself into the idea that there is no stressor, that there is nothing wrong. It actually can be effective under certain conditions. So if there's something where, say, there was a past stressor, and if, say, repeatedly encountering things that remind you of that past stressor would be causing you additional and continuing stress, avoiding things that remind you of that might be a good thing in order to continue with your day-to-day life. Where that becomes problematic, though, is if you start having to avoid more and more things, more and more places. So you might start avoiding locations that remind you of that stressor, people who remind you of it, or even events that are reminiscent of that event. So think of individuals who've gone through traumatic moments. They might start avoiding more and more things that remind them of that, and it can eventually lead to you completely changing your behavior. So again, if there's only something mildly inconvenient, say you don't go to a particular part of the city because of a past bad experience, and that doesn't affect your day-to-day life, this isn't necessarily a bad approach, but in a lot of cases, it can have some pretty large-scale impacts on your day-to-day behavior, and therefore might not always be a good idea. Of course, if you can't block it completely from your mind, another approach that people would argue is healthier in most cases is something called rationalization. And here, this is all about facing and overcoming that stressor, or at least attempting to overcome the stressor. Obviously, on the surface, having to face something that's been causing stress and come to terms with it can be a lot more anxiety-inducing than simply ignoring it and hoping it goes away, or pretending like it doesn't exist. So this is something where you might have to put in a lot more effort to actually approach that stressor, come to terms with it, and move on in your life. So this might come along with things like, say, long time spent in therapy, having somebody guide you through that process in a healthy and adaptable way. While there are lots and lots of different approaches that can be taken, especially through therapeutic techniques for rationalization, the three basic steps for rational coping, or this rationalization process, are going to move through acceptance, then exposure, and then understanding. So acceptance is basically going against what we had for repression, where you pretend it doesn't exist. Acceptance is saying, yes, it exists. I'm acknowledging that it's here. I accept that it's a thing. Then exposure is going to usually involve actively seeking out that stressor or just sitting and being aware of that stressor. So if you've heard of, say, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, that's the term, that would be a method of exposure. So cognitive behavior therapy is all about thinking about things that cause you stress and forcing yourself to think about them, exist in the moment, letting that stress come, but while also tying it in with other things like, say, body relaxing techniques, which will come up when we talk about controlling the body. But you can calm your autonomic nervous system that's activated that fight or flight response. So you allow yourself to think of that stressor, to experience that stress, and focus on the fact that you are fine in the moment. You're okay. You can take deep breaths. You can slowly relax your body. You can overcome that fight or flight response. And through a lot of learning and conditioning techniques, you can actually find that you slowly have less and less of a fear response, of a stress response to that stressor with continued exposure. So you might also see this called prolonged exposure. So this is just having long periods of time where you sit and expose yourself to whatever that stressor was. So whether it's, say, a traumatic memory or a situation that's coming up that you can visualize as being stressful. So something like, you have to give a talk in front of a large group of people. So maybe you're going to practice sitting and visualizing talking in front of people. And this doesn't just have to be imaginal work. We'll get into this more in treatments for psychological disorders, but part of exposure therapy can actually involve going and physically confronting that thing. So if you have a fear of dogs, dogs stress you out, you might go and choose to sit in a room with a dog until dogs no longer stress you out. Or if you have to give a talk in front of a large group of people, maybe you're going to practice, give a talk in front of a smaller group, then a slightly larger group, until eventually you are no longer having such a strong response to that event. So the exposure is supposed to gradually lessen your response, and it can be helpful in reducing the amount of stress you experience from thinking about it or actually facing that event. And then, of course, at the end here, you want to work on reconciling everything. So, yes, it was something that stressed you out. You've gone through some of the work with exposure or other kinds of treatment, and now you're trying to find the meaning for that stressor in your life. What has it led you to? Can you frame it in a way, sort of reframe it in a way that makes you feel like you've overcome it, or that maybe it's led you to something good that's come afterwards? Now, this last stage of coming to an understanding might not always happen because, of course, if you've been through a traumatic event and have had sort of long term stress because of that, there might not be a real reason for it. You might have been the target of violence with no fault of your own. So, in those cases, this is sort of coming to terms with the fact that, yes, this thing happened. I've done what I can about it. How am I going to move forward? So this can look very different depending on the individual, but it can help to basically come to terms with what you've experienced, sort of maybe even acknowledging that you can't change it, that you're just going to move forward and use whatever skills you've sort of acquired from it or whatever. So this, again, fairly vague because it depends on the situation and the individual, but it's all about sort of how are you going to use this moving forward? How are you going to accept that this is a thing that has happened? How do you move on in your life? Then we can move into reframing. And this is something that should not be surprising because we've talked a lot about our appraisals and how we think about different things, different events that are going to be stressors. But this can also be, again, about past stressors or upcoming future ones, but it's all about how do we think about this? How do we appraise a situation or how do we frame a situation? So, reframing as a way of coping with stress is just thinking about or finding a new way to think about a stressor so that you can reduce that perceived threat. So when we talked about appraisals, we actually talked about the fact that we want to think about both how we are capable of sort of being prepared for this thing coming up, this stressor that's approaching, as well as thinking about the demands that stressor is going to place on us. And we had said that if we can sort of frame the demands as lesser than the resources we have available to us, then we're more likely to think of it as a challenge versus a threat. Reframing something so that you see it as a challenge, that it's a positive, it's a chance to overcome something, means that you are then taking less of that threatening approach. You don't think it's going to be as dangerous, you're going to have less of a stress response to it, and that can be beneficial. So there's lots and lots of ways that we can sort of try and reframe things, whether it's through our appraisal model or even just things like focusing on more positive frameworks. Things like, I'm looking forward to being able to show myself that I can overcome this. Something like that, having that kind of affirmation can actually make you more able to handle that stressful situation. The way we think about things has a lot of power on how we actually handle those things. And so there's something called stress inoculation training, or SIT. And this is a technique where we actually teach people how to reframe stressful situations, basically giving them tools to think more positively about situations they might encounter. And this kind of training can make people more likely to feel competent and capable of handling stressors moving forward. So it can actually be beneficial. So the way that we think about stress can end up affecting how we respond to that stress, which is really neat to see. So moving out of controlling the mind, let's get into controlling the body. Because obviously, when we're experiencing stress, we've already talked about those physiological responses. The fact that our autonomic nervous system has kicked in and we have all of our stress hormones moving around. But when we're experiencing stress, we probably notice a whole bunch of other physiological things going on in our bodies. Things like carrying tension in our muscles. A lot of people will carry tension in their necks, or maybe you clench your jaw so your jaw gets tight. Maybe you spend a lot of time with your hands clenched. Maybe you hunch over. Maybe you feel ill all the time because you have that stress response messing with your digestive tract. Or things like your hands are sweaty because in a fight or flight response, we're not prioritizing sending blood to the extremities. We're prioritizing our core, where all of our important organs are. So we have lots of things that are going to sort of come about because of that fight or flight response, because of the shift in activation in that autonomic nervous system. So, with all of these physiological responses, with all these things that we can encounter within our bodies, obviously, there are going to be ways that we can try and mediate this, ways that we can try and reduce that responsiveness. So, specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about actually calming our bodies down, relaxing them. But meditation is really just a matter of being mindful in a particular moment. So, depending on what your focus is, depending on your techniques, you might choose to focus on your breathing or focus on a particular sound or a particular thought. Maybe you have a certain mantra that you are repeating. But the goal here with meditation is to get to this state of calm and relaxation where you're going to have your body sort of slow down. You're going to force this relaxation where your muscles are going to relax. You're going to breathe more slowly. And as you sort of coax your body into calming back down again, you can reduce the activation of that sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to slow everything down. We're going to get back to a normal state. And meditation is actually a very effective practice. There's lots and lots of different studies that have looked at the effects of meditation, but it ties to things like reduced experience of pain. It can lead people to feel more capable of facing a stressor. We can see reduced muscle tension and a whole bunch of other things as well. But the base idea is it's a conscious practice of trying to relax your body through focused relaxation. So whatever the method is that you use to get there, that's the big idea to it. We can also talk relaxation therapy. This is a technique where you're specifically trying to relax your muscles to reduce tension. There's a couple of variations on this, and one of them, which again might come up when we talk about treatment, because it's often paired with things like cognitive behavior therapy, but this can include things like intentionally tensing your muscles to then force them to relax after that tensing. And by doing this, especially if it's done in a more systematic method, so say starting at the bottom of your feet, can you tense your toes? Can you clench your toes and then relax them? Okay, now tense your feet and relax them. Tense your calves and relax them. By slowly progressing through all the different muscle groups and forcing relaxation after the tension, it's almost like meditation in that there's this directed focus and this sort of push to relax and be calm. And it's often paired with things like slow, even breathing, but it's sort of a sequential relaxation as part of a therapeutic approach. And of course, our goal here being to reduce that muscle tension, but through the process, we'll also have our cortical activity slow down. So our brains are going to calm down. We see less activation. Our heart rate's going to slow. Our breathing is going to slow down. Our blood pressure goes down. So you can think of this as we're, again, forcing that autonomic nervous system to slow down, to go back towards our state of homeostasis. Our bodies go back to our balanced resting state. And you can even get more relaxed than a standard resting state would be, depending on the technique, because sometimes you're just going to get, say, below your resting heart rate if you relax enough, especially, again, in tie to, say, meditation or something similar. So you can get that heart rate slowed, your breathing rate slowed, your body slows right down. And it's almost like competing responses, where if you're forcing calm and relaxation, you can't also have a stress response. Your fight or flight cannot be active if we're also forcing calm. So by focusing on that calming, that slowing of the autonomic nervous system, we're undermining that stress response. And yeah, so talking about all of these different types of relaxation techniques, you can tie this into the concept of mindfulness. So this would be where you're specifically trying to focus on the present moment. So again, these are going to overlap a little bit. This could be part of meditation, depending on what it is that you're focusing on, whether you're concentrating on your breathing or something else. But mindfulness could be a matter of maybe trying to focus on everything in your environment, maybe focusing on a single thing. And this can tie into sort of less of a I'm sitting and meditating and only focusing on this one thing while I deep breathe. Mindfulness can be while you're actively engaging in your day, you can look at something that's present in that moment and be mindful or aware of its existence. You can incorporate things like having very accepting thoughts. You look at things and don't necessarily pass judgment, just accept it as it is. So this could be going outside and there was snow over the weekend. So, all right, well, there's snow, and I could think of it as a bad thing that, oh, it's winter's coming and everything's going to get cold and everything's going to be slippery. Or we could just accept it as something that's there. So you're accepting that that's something that's present. You don't have to frame it as good or bad. You're just sort of acknowledging it and moving on. So you have a more sort of peaceful approach to things. You can also focus on things like recognizing your own thought patterns, recognizing your own internal feelings, and again, acknowledging them without necessarily framing them as good or bad. So I was upset about snow, but I'm becoming sort of more accepting of it. I'm also acknowledging that my response, my not being happy about it, is something that happened. And it happened. But I'm going to move on and do something more. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to go on to my next task. So this mindfulness is actually very useful in helping people approach stressful situations and maybe think about how they handle those stressful situations without adding extra stress in terms of judgment and framing things as negative. We'll actually get to see the fact that your framework and your likelihood of, say, being pessimistic towards a situation can end up making you more stressed. It can make you more susceptible to stressors. And therefore, something like a relaxation technique or mindfulness or any of these where you're not overthinking, you're not framing things negatively, can be really beneficial. And then just here we have related to this, mindfulness-based stress reduction is just one of the terms that they might see in conjunction with this concept of mindfulness, but the idea being use mindfulness to reduce stress. So focus on that mindfulness, that awareness, that acceptance without negative frameworks, without judgment. And it tends to be associated with things like reduced medical symptoms, your pain perception, you tend to be less susceptible to pain. We tend to see less physical problems after things like, say, a surgery. And overall, it tends to correlate with better quality of life, say, post-stressful event. And I think most of these, because we're focusing on sort of physical health stuff, most of these studies are tying to after, say, surgical practices, things like that. So we tend to see people improve faster to have that better mindset and correlate that with better outcomes following those surgeries. So yeah, just sort of mentioning one of the different techniques, one of the specific terms you might encounter. All right, moving on. Still talking about the body. This is an interesting technique called biofeedback. Now, I will right off the bat say that biofeedback is not necessarily as effective as people would like. So, what is it? This is when you're using some kind of external monitoring device to obtain information about bodily function with the hopes that you would be able to gain control over that function. Now, we talk sometimes about things like EEG biofeedback or neurofeedback, which is basically you have a device, monitors your brain activity, and you're able to see that activity. The goal of biofeedback is that you would see your brain activation and you would focus on that until you can reduce the amount of activity. Basically, training yourself to recognize when you have really high spikes in that particular sensor. So lots and lots of brain activity in a certain area, and you're going to focus on slowing it down. So this can end up overlapping a little bit with meditation because you're focusing on something and working to calm or relax whatever it's measuring. And it seems kind of strange, like you can see your brain activity, so you learn to slow your brain activity, but it's basically making you aware of the fact that the activity is there. The downside to this is that in practice, the effects are fairly small and are almost equivalent to just using a general relaxation technique. So biofeedback isn't necessarily any better than having just engaged in meditation or a full body relaxation exercise or something like that. Though if you want a different example, something that I tend to find useful on occasion, if you have, say, a Fitbit, something that maybe tracks your heart rate or even your breathing rate, depending on what kind of a thing you have. But maybe you're having a day and you're finding that your heart is racing. Maybe you have a test coming up and you're very aware of your heart rate. So you might pause, look at your heart rate monitor, and focus on that. Maybe tie it with some deep breathing until you can bring it back into your normal range of acceptable heart rate. So it forces that awareness, and you can take action along with looking at what your body is doing in order to bring it back to a more homeostatic point. Basically, get yourself back to your resting heart rate. Now, the examples the textbook uses are a little bit more in mind with the EEG, following your brain activation and stuff like that. But there are a couple of variations on this, obviously. Now, as we've said, it tends to be fairly useful, but because it is going to help with things like getting our brain waves back into order, basically slowing things down, preventing sort of atypical spikes. But it tends to also then encourage us to relax. And it's associated with reduction in pain perception, especially across long periods of time. But like I said, it's probably not significantly more effective than just normal relaxation or meditation techniques. And depending on the method you're using, might be very time consuming or expensive. Because, yeah, EEGs are okay, it's just electrodes on the surface of your head. But if you went, say, an fMRI, that's a pretty expensive procedure. So It's a thing, it does have an effect. However, it isn't necessarily the best approach. And one more thing with our controlling the body here, and this is aerobic exercise. And it seems really weird to lump this in with all of these other relaxation and meditation and high focus techniques, but exercise, and specifically aerobic exercise, is the type of exercise that gets your body moving to the point that your heart rate will increase, that you're increasing your breathing rate, you're taking in more oxygen. But getting your body moving, your blood flowing, oxygen coming into your lungs, stretching your lungs, all of that is something that's associated with sort of increasing your endorphins, can also associate with increased serotonin. People tend to enjoy moving once they've started moving, but it also ties to things like overall health. So by getting your heart up and your breathing rate increased, using your lungs, moving your body, this tends to keep you healthy. And the healthier your body is, the better you handle stressors when they come in. So aerobic exercise can be good from a whole bunch of different perspectives. So it can get your body healthier and more capable of handling stressful situations that you encounter, but it can also itself be something that reduces stress as you're experiencing it. So people might feel powerful because they've gone and worked out. By increasing that heart rate and having those endorphins released, they might actually physically feel good. So you might have that increased enjoyment. And by moving, sometimes maybe you go and do exercise, say in a class, or you go running with a friend. We'll actually see that that social aspect can be really useful as well. So aerobic exercise is one of the things that comes up in a lot of the stress and health literature because it helps with both stress and health and is beneficial on both counts. Though one thing to note is that with aerobic exercise, people sometimes have the misconception that more exercise is better. However, it is possible to overdo it. People can over-exercise. They can push themselves too hard and put unnecessary strain on their heart and lungs. So you always want to be careful about that. Typically, moderate levels of exercise are going to be far more beneficial than going too extreme. But of course, if you don't go extreme enough, you're then not getting into that aerobic realm where you've increased your heart rate and oxygen intake. This is one of the reasons why if you've used exercise equipment, say in the gym or even at home, a lot of them nowadays will have ways of monitoring your heart rate. You might be more aware of how fast your heart's beating. You might focus on your own breathing, and those will keep you sometimes within a specific range. The very fancy equipment will actually have optimal ranges based on age and sex, because there are going to be sort of averages that you might want to stick within. And again, as you get older, you don't want to put undue stress on your body, so you tend not to have as high goal heart rates as you would when you're younger. So yeah, some things to keep in mind, but aerobic exercise tends to be good. And then last component here is starting to talk about controlling the situation. Now, a lot of this is going to be fairly similar logic to what we've used before, but when we're looking at controlling the situation, we might use the term situation management because it's a process where we're just trying to change our life, change our environment to reduce stress. Now, there's a couple of topics we're going to hit on here. The textbook talks about humor and procrastination, so we'll cover those very, very briefly without needing our own slides. But social support, as well as the way that we sort of frame spirituality or religion, and then also getting into some personality stuff that's going to tie in with this, those will get their own slides in a moment. First off, humor, so laughing at a bad situation. You might have gotten to a point where so many things keep going wrong and you are so stressed that there's nothing to do but laugh at yourself. And in short terms, we'll actually find that humor can help with us to cope with stress in the short term. So it tends to make us less sensitive to pain and stress, but it tends not to have long-term effects on our resilience to stress over time. Basically, it's going to give us that you feel better in the moment. Laughing makes you happier in the moment. It's going to make you feel good, but it's not necessarily going to build up to long-term health. So it might be maybe if it's tied to, say, certain patterns of thinking and certain maybe optimistic thought patterns, and framing things as humorous rather than threatening, that might be more helpful in the long term. But just laughing itself is not necessarily going to fix everything, which kind of makes sense. Procrastination is another big one, which will again kind of tie to our discussion on personality in a moment. But basically, if you procrastinate, you're putting off a task until later. So this might be, I don't want to do it right now. It's too hard. It's going to be really boring. I have better things to do. Well, by putting something off, now not only are you then going to encounter a situation where you're under a larger time crunch and you have less time to face that stressor, so we're now more likely to frame it as a threat rather than a challenge because of that time crunch. We also have to deal with the fact that you tend to still be aware that that thing needs to be done. So you know that it's coming, and you might have low levels of stress all the way up until you finish that task. So by putting it off, you're keeping yourself in that state of stress for longer periods of time. So what's the best way to approach this? Well, try and plan ahead. Try and have good time management to avoid procrastination, because procrastinating leads to higher levels of stress in the long run and can mean that you feel sort of more wear and tear. So we want to avoid procrastination as much as possible. Now, as I said, those are pretty quick and easy to talk about without their own slides, but getting into social support and even religious and spiritual approaches, those need their own sets of slides. So first off, social support. Social support is when we get help from interacting with others. So being with other people, having people to rely on can actually be really protective when it comes to the experiences of stress. It helps blunt how much of an impact a stressful situation can have, so we don't feel it as strongly. Um, there's a bunch of different ways we can frame social support. I really like this division, talking about 4 different kinds of social support. The first being emotional. This is something like having a friend who will text you every once in a while to just say that they believe in you, they care about you, they're thinking about you. So, in these cases, knowing that somebody is there, somebody is supporting you, someone believes in you, it can make you feel more capable. Remember when we talked about self efficacy? Feeling like you can handle a stressful situation actually makes you more likely to be able to handle that stressful situation. So, feeling capable with someone's support can be really helpful in how you approach stress. Instrumental support. This is when you have actual tangible help. So if you have, I'm going to keep going, friends who are able to help. So something like you're really stressed. You have an upcoming exam in like 3 of your 5 classes, and you have to go to class because one of your instructors doesn't record, doesn't have PowerPoints. So maybe you have a friend in the class who says, "Oh, I'll just take really good notes and I'll give you a copy of my notes." That's instrumental support because they're physically helping you out. They're going to give you something that is useful, that helps you handle an upcoming stressful situation. And having that physical help is going to allow you to approach that stressor with more resources in your pocket. We can have informational support. This is when you get information, advice, things that people can add to help you face a stressor with more preparation. So, something like maybe you have a friend who's taken that same class as you in a previous semester, and they can give you advice about what to study, about what kinds of questions they might encounter, about maybe stuff that they can skip studying because the instructor rarely asks about it. That information, once again, can help with our appraisals of a situation. I now know what to study and what not to study. I can distribute my resources more beneficially. I can be more efficient in my approach, and therefore I'm better able to face this stressor as a challenge rather than a threat. And appraisal support can actually be directly helping with that appraisal process. They can help us maybe be more objective in the potential demands of an upcoming stressor. So you're freaking out about an upcoming exam, and your friend talks you down, says, "Hey, you've actually only got to study these 2 chapters. You already know this one chapter. You're really good at these things. So here are the resources you already have. Here's what you need to know for that test. Here's all that you should have to study. Let's evaluate the two. How much do you already know? How much needs to be learned? Let's appraise the situation. And this can be really useful because some people, especially again, will look at neuroticism and pessimism in terms of personality traits. But some individuals are more likely to frame things negatively. They might overestimate demands or underestimate resources or both, and be a lot more likely to frame situations as way more threatening than they need to be. So you might help prevent someone having that maladaptive framework and give them sort of a more realistic framing or appraisal of the situation. Also, other things, having people around, having your support system, this can help you feel like you belong, feel accepted. It might keep you from having some of these maladaptive ways of coping. Maybe you have a friend who knows when you're starting to panic about something and can talk you down. They can help you sort of take an objective stance and appraise more appropriately. But having other people around is beneficial, and it tends to correlate with things like improved immune functioning. It can have increases in sort of recovering faster, I think is the words I'm trying to say. So after surgeries, people tend to recover faster when they have social support systems there to help them, and a whole bunch of other things. When we look at sort of the specifics of social support, there are some sex differences that tend to show up. The first is that women tend to be more likely to seek support when they're stressed. And while we've talked before about our fight or flight response when it comes to stress, which tends to line up with men and how they cope with stress, which is they tend to face the situation and either approach it directly in a more sort of fight approach or retreat and deal with it internally on their own, maybe flight, but they tend to do things more solo. Women tend to find groups, support groups, people who are going to be with them, friend groups. And this can be tied to some biological stuff. So, when in the presence of estrogen, which is a hormone that's present in much higher levels in women than men, though men do still have low levels of estrogen. But when estrogen is present in higher levels, a hormone called oxytocin tends to trigger more social responses. Oxytocin is sometimes called the love chemical, but it's basically going to facilitate social interactions. It helps with bonding between parents and children. It helps for bonding between mated pairs when we look at non-human animals. So this substance tends to encourage social interactions and makes those social interactions more reinforcing. They're more rewarding. So we see more of that. And men don't have that same sort of boost to that bonding and social interaction event. So we tend to see women are more likely to find friend groups. They're more likely to have people around them to give them support. And when they're in their friend groups, they're more likely to feel comfortable and seen and heard and able to talk about, say, the negative things they're encountering. In contrast, men tend to be more sort of on their own. They tend to deal with things themselves. And by self isolating and maybe even musing over and sort of ruminating on some of these stressors, they might have more negative effects because they don't have somebody to tell them that they're not framing something appropriately. They don't have somebody to talk about their appraisal. They don't have somebody to share information and all of those things. So it can make stress more stressful. It should be noted here, though, that with this idea of sort of different sex differences in seeking social support, this is not something that is purely biological. This is not something that happens in isolation of all of the other factors we need to consider with sex differences. One of the biggest ones here are cultures and I guess social norms. So either cultural or social norms. But basically, it is more socially acceptable for women to, say, show weakness, show that they are stressed, show that they want help. Whereas for men, there's a lot of, suck it up, deal with it yourself, be tough. You don't have to go to someone else. It's weak to go to someone else. And those mindsets are fairly toxic, as we've seen, where being on your own and not having social support can actually make stressors more stressful for an individual. So we also just want to acknowledge the whole social norms can also impact this. It's not just the biological, which they don't do a good job of talking about that in the textbook. The last little bit here, talking about religious or spiritual practice. This can also tie into things like meditation, where we were saying there could be practices within a religion or a spirituality where there is this mindfulness. It can be things like actual meditative practice, but it can also be things like having a consistent routine, having a ritual associated with your beliefs can be soothing to some individuals. I suppose I should first off read the descriptions on the slides here. We're talking about religiosity is when you have an affiliation with or an engagement in the practices of a particular religion. So all sorts of different religions around the world, and pretty much all of them are going to have rituals, routines, things that people engage in frequently, and that repetition can become comforting. Spirituality is going to be having a belief in and engagement with some higher power, but it isn't necessarily linked to any particular religion. And both of these can have either helpful or hindering associations with stress. So this is kind of interesting because it's all about framing yet again. So the helpful effects are going to be things like feeling like you belong, feeling like you have a community. In those cases, tying maybe to some social support, because oftentimes religions will come with, say, a congregation, people of like-minded backgrounds who you can talk to. But there's also things like oh, we've mentioned self-efficacy before, where we'd said that if we feel like we have no power, that it's all outside of our own control, that can make stressful situations more stressful. Spirituality or religiosity can actually allow people to come to terms with having no self-control by putting it in the hands of some higher power, especially if you have a belief that that higher power is a generally good force. You then are less bothered by having that control taken away. I've handed that control over to someone that I trust, and therefore I'm less stressed about what will come. So in those cases, we can see that this is associated with lower rates of heart disease, reduced experiences of chronic pain, and overall health in the long run. But of course, in the literature, there's always going to be things to consider. So if there is a negative connotation within religion, so say an over focus on sin or having done poorly and being judged by it, that can make people overly stressed because now they're stressing about maybe going against the rules of their religion. So that might add stress depending on the individual and the situation. Now, I'm just sort of sticking to the positives and why that framing can be beneficial. I just always like to acknowledge when there is variation from certain aspects within the literature. And obviously, all of these are very complicated areas of research, and we are only talking about them very, very briefly. So this is not a complete picture. I have at the very end here mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit about personality and some of those sort of long-term things that influence behavior. So with personality, in our personality chapter, we didn't actually talk about type A and type B personalities. If you are unfamiliar with them, this is something that isn't necessarily tied to any of the personality discussions we've had so far. But if you've heard somebody talk about, oh, that person is so type a type A personality is somebody who likes to be in control. They tend to be very driven, very particular. They want things done their way and they want it done as quickly as possible. So these individuals tend to be very competitive. They tend to be impatient. They want everything done fast. And this sometimes comes with, say, anger and hostility issues because they would lash out. They're very driven. So this can be beneficial if we think about, say, doctors, lawyers, people who have very prestigious careers tend to be type A personalities. But We would then think that if you were high strung and pushing all the time and competitive and focused on sort of urgency and pushing others to have things your own way, this is going to put you under larger rates of stress. So what do we see in practice? Some of the literature shows that yes, type A personalities do have higher risk of heart disease than type B personalities. Type B personalities being a lot more relaxed, a lot more easygoing, less aggressive, less focused on urgency and deadlines and having things done their way. They're a lot less competitive, a lot less aggressive. So type A personalities are a little bit more likely to have heart disease in the long run, but it's not as strong as we would have predicted with how polar opposite these two personality types seem to be. But in sort of larger meta-analyses, basically collapsing the data across tons and tons of studies, people have found that if we only focus on the anger and aggression rather than specifically the personality categorization, we find that individuals that are high in anger, that are more aggressive than others, they tend to have higher rates of heart disease. Basically saying that personality, type A or B, is not necessarily a great indicator of how likely you are to have heart disease in the future. But if we look at rates of aggression, then that tends to be a pretty good predictor of future risk of heart disease. So it's not necessarily type A or type B that's causing that risk. It might be a lot more related to the fact that type A personalities also tend to be angrier and more aggressive, and that might be what ties to those sort of effects of stress. But that's another one of those correlations rather than causal claims, as is fairly common with human psychology. Another topic, neuroticism. Again, we've mentioned this before. Individuals that are high in neuroticism, they are the ones who tend to be a lot more volatile. They experience negative emotions a lot more often. And another thing to go along with this is not only are they more likely to be stressed and high anxiety and experience those negative emotions, they tend also to have maladaptive behaviors that actually puts them in situations that are high stress. So part of their actions and their inability to plan might lead them to encounter stressful situations way more often, where they are then more likely to experience heightened negative emotions because of that environment. So this tends to be sort of that spiral where they make the situation worse and worse. We talked neuroticism again in personality as one of our big five, but it also relates to a bunch of the other models beyond just the big five. And then the last one, or no, two more. First, optimism. Optimism is the belief that things will work out. And optimism, while most of our models of personality didn't talk about it on its own, optimism and pessimism, sort of that spectrum of framing things positively versus negatively for pessimism, this tends to be fairly stable over time. So optimists tend to be optimistic most of the time. And pessimists tend to be pessimistic most of the time. And if someone is optimistic, they feel less helpless. So, in a situation when they have to think about what resources they have, what they can do to act in a situation, they feel like they can do more. They feel like they have more options, more resources. This helps them with having better adjustment to negative life events. When we had started talking about that inventory of stressful events in life, an optimist would actually experience less overall stress from the same event that a pessimist would. And this all correlates to having better health overall. They tend to have fewer negative health outcomes in the long run. Though, interestingly, even though optimism and pessimism tend to be a fairly consistent thing across a person's lifetime, there are ways of training yourself to be more optimistic. So, things like focusing on mindfulness and actively trying to change your thought patterns can help overcome some of those innate problems that come with being pessimistic. So, you can see that you can learn to overcome some of those thought patterns and improve your health and your ability to handle stress moving forward. And then this time, for sure, the last one is hardiness. And hardiness is just talking about your resilience, how you are able to resist stress. So high hardiness means that you are very capable of resisting and sort of persisting through stressful situations. So these individuals are going to come across as more thick-skinned. Basically, stressful events are going to sort of bounce off them, have very little of an effect. They're going to handle stressful situations a lot better and experience fewer negative health consequences moving forward. So what do we see in people who show high levels of hardiness? They tend to feel committed to whatever their actions are. So they have something stressful coming up. You have to give a talk in front of a class, but you are really committed to doing well in this class. So you're going to handle that stressor, that giving a talk in front of the class, because it's part of what you're doing and you are doing what you want to be doing. So this is something that I have control over. I'm going to sort of do my best with this. I'm going to face it head on. So they believe they have control. They're going to accept it as a challenge. They are committed to approaching that situation. So all of this helps them be a little bit more resilient when it comes to stress.